for the session, The Day of the Dragon, China and the Future of Asia.
All right, this sounds good. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And while I'm not used to, as a foreign policy analyst, seeing large crowds come out for foreign policy, I know that today's session is particularly interesting because the subject is particularly interesting this year. When we say the Day of the Dragon, we're in our minds wondering, are we talking about the day, the week, the month, the year, or the century of the dragon, really? When we talk about China and what China's future means for the future of Asia. Will China's rise mean actually Asia's rise? Are we looking at an Asian century? If India and China are going to be #1 and #2 in this region, is it inevitable that they should clash? So why are we so interested in it this year is because a lot has happened this year. And, you know, just even from the point of view of our panelists today, there is so much to process and so much to take in. Xi Jinping has come out as the strongest Chinese leader since perhaps Deng Xiaoping and possibly Mao after the Party Congress last year. We've seen China come out with its Belt and Road Initiative, hold its first forum in 2017, and really make it clear that they intend to go ahead with this project, whether it costs $1 trillion or, you know, the more modest estimates, and what it means for their bilateral relations with each of the 64 countries that have signed on to it. Apart from that, we see naval tensions rising. Terms like the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, are terms that are seen as a reactionary entity, you know, that India, the US, Australia, and Japan are really reacting to China's behavior with terms that perhaps indicate that they want to contain them. We see China taking a political role. You know, all these decades we've always said, yeah, well, China gets involved in countries, but that involvement is always limited to transactions and to economic transactions, infrastructure building, and all the rest. Now we see a political role, whether it was Zimbabwe last year, whether it was the Bangladesh-Myanmar MOU, or in fact China's attempt to broker some kind of an agreement between Pakistan and Afghanistan. We are looking at a China that we don't necessarily recognize or have come to understand over all these decades. Finally, we see a China in conflict with India. And I say that word you know, without meaning that it means a conflagration. But we are rubbing up against each other. We normally talk about 3.5 fronts between India and China because, of course, the first one is the land boundary, 3,488 kilometers of a land boundary between India and China. So when they talk about, you know, conflict for India and China, it's very real and it's right there. And in the last year, we've seen the Doklam standoff that lasted 73 days before they disengaged. The second front is in the waters, in the South China Sea or the Indo-Pacific as it's now known, India committing to work with other countries to essentially keep the sea lanes open, to essentially talk about the rule of law. Clearly, that is something aimed at China. The third front is the front India has worried about the most perhaps in the last few years, and that is South Asia. As China improves its ties with each of the South Asian countries, and I don't need to remind us that every country except for Bhutan is now a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, India begins to feel like it is being cornered in its own backyard. And the half front which we don't know which way it'll go, is of course the Tibetan issue. With the Dalai Lama taking, making new statements in the past year, in particular about the possibility of talks with China. We are seeing the Tibetan issue evolve in a certain way where India is going to have to consider its next steps, which it has stayed away from for the past few decades. So let me bring my guests on. They've been introduced to you, but I want to make the point that each of our panelists today has spent a lot of time studying not just China, but what China's rise really has entailed in the last few years. Michael Vatikiotis is the author of a new book, Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia. He's written about China, but also how China engages with Southeast Asia and what it's beginning to mean in each of these Southeast Asian countries. Because we are only now beginning to study what China's engagement in South Asia has meant excuse me, for our neighbors. Michael has also lived and worked in Southeast Asia for 40 years and has been a mediator in conflict, including in Myanmar, for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. Humphrey Hawksley is a very famous name for journalists, particularly television journalists, just because his books have always struck fear. They're called Dragon Strike, Dragon Fire, and the Third World War. Future history is that your term?
The Third World War?
Future history?
Future history was the publisher's view of it, because it hadn't actually happened, but it could happen.
It could happen. So his scenarios of what could happen are now, we're going to see the next one, which is called Asian Waters, the Strategy of Chinese Expansion and the Struggle over the South China Sea. That's out as well. And Tom Miller is a writer and journalist who's lived in China for 14 years before he returned to the UK this year. He has actually traveled to 130 Chinese cities and written about urbanization in China. But his latest project, the book China's Asian Dream, has taken him down the Silk Road. He has actually engaged with some of these projects that I have to say, in India, there's still a sort of question about whether any of these projects are going to take off and what it's going to do to the countries they're in. So Tom, if I could ask you, because of the time period you have seen most closely, the last 14 years, what really explains this big change? The last time we looked at China, they were talking about talks. They were talking about a peaceful rise, about holding your fire, as it were, and increasing your internal strength. What happened?
Well, obviously, it's a complex topic, and perhaps it'd be nice if there was someone Chinese on the panel to kind of explain. But as I spent a lot of time,
you speak Chinese.
I do speak Chinese. I speak it at home. My wife is Chinese, but so I will do my best to explain to you how Chinese people think. I think there's sort of one answer to what you're saying, to simplify things enormously, and that is Mr. Xi Jinping, the president, who has made a huge, huge difference. But I think before I get there, I'd like to very, very briefly try to explain what the China or the Chinese dream means, which is really Xi Jinping's signature phrase, if you like, and to try to kind of put you in the head of Chinese people. Because I think, to lots of people, and I think it's particularly true actually here in India, China looks like a big scary monster, okay? But that's not how China feels. Chinese people don't feel like they're in a country which is a big scary monster. They feel that they live in a country which was humiliated for many, many years. They feel that there's a lack of self-confidence, if you like, in China. There has been for a long time. That is now changing. But it's a country that's been threatened by outsiders for a very, very long time. And they look back in history, and you don't have to look back too far. If you go back to the mid-late 18th century, China, in Chinese eyes, was the great civilization state of Asia, certainly East Asia. And then, it had been this great nation for a long time, or great civilization state is a better way of putting it. It was a place to which neighboring countries paid tribute. The Confucian world was, this great kind of cultural center. But then starting with the Opium Wars in 1839, basically all of that unraveled. And, it was started by those dastardly Brits, of which I'm one. But then,
You're responsible for a lot, then.
They're responsible for an awful lot. So you had this very, very sort of great civilization which sort of fell to its knees. It got worse in 1895 with the Sino-Japanese War, and then, of course, in the 1930s with the Japanese invasion. And, by the time that the Communist Party took over in the late 1940s, China lay sort of battered and backward and bruised, if you like. It was a great nation that had been brought down to nothing. And this is known in China as national humiliation. And every single child in Chinese schools is taught never forget national humiliation, okay? So the Chinese dream is about restoring China's greatness. In Chinese eyes, China is naturally the great civilization state of its part of the world, and it wants to restore that. And this is really how Xi Jinping defines the Chinese dream. It's about achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And he's actually defined that. So he talks about 2 centenary goals. The first goal is that by 2021, which is the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, that China will be a moderately prosperous society, basically economically reasonably wealthy. Everyone lives well at home. And that by 2049, the second goal is to achieve this great rejuvenation. To put it in Trumpian terms, it means to make China great again. And I think, that clearly has implications for the world. China was this great state. It wants to be that great state again. China wants to dominate the East as the US has dominated the West. And I think, we've seen a very sort of clear shift in Chinese foreign policy to try to make that happen. Now, at this point, I'd like to try to teach you a little bit of Chinese. Does anyone here speak Chinese? Could I have hands in the audience? So we've got one. I think maybe one or possibly two. There was a half hand there. So Deng Xiaoping, who was the great Chinese leader after Chairman Mao, really sort of set the foreign policy agenda for 30 years. And he said that China should hide its strength and bide its time, okay? And in Chinese, that's 韬光养晦. So can everyone say 韬, then 光养晦. So 韬光养晦. All right. So that literally means 韬光means hide light, 养晦means nurture obscurity. So what China did was to try to become strong at home first, which is really about economic development. And then when it got to the right stage, it would then stop nurturing obscurity and then come out on the global stage. That is what we've seen under Xi Jinping. He's abandoned 韬光养晦. And now China is proactively, as he puts it, pursuing a much more a sort of foreign policy whereby China is going to try to lead. And China now is very much trying to lead Asia. We see that with the Belt and Road, which is really their way of doing that. China has enormous economic power, and it's using that to try to build infrastructure across Asia. And I'll stop there before I go on for too long.
But you make several very good points which I want to pick up on. The first thing, Michael, I would like to ask, is this Xi Jinping's idea of making his nation great again, reviving China's old glory, getting past national humiliation, that different from what we've seen perhaps Turkish President Erdogan do, or even Mr. Trump do, or perhaps Prime Minister Modi? This sort of populism and this kind of idea that we have to get over our past of humiliation is a running theme through the world. What makes Xi Jinping's practice of it different?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, what Tom says is a very, very good introduction and primer. But I think there are two additional things that when it comes to looking at how China is going to wield this power. First is not everything is going to be able to be planned by China. As China moves out into the world, like other great powers, it's going to encounter issues that it has to learn how to deal with. And most importantly, as an emerging great power, China is going to have to learn to intervene. Now, the problem with intervention is that China tries to live by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which actually I believe India also...
Banshi, yeah.
Banshi. So China takes those rather seriously, or at least superficially. And one of the great challenges of Chinese foreign policy in this new era that Tom so, I think, describes so well, is how are we supposed to intervene in global crises and in our neighborhood if actually we have these these 5 principles. So what's happening now is that there is a great deal of effort going on in China to try and write a new justification for intervention. For instance, in Myanmar and Bangladesh, for instance, in dealing with the South China Sea issue, how do we more actively and in a more muscular way, both involving diplomacy but also military strength, actually intervene? And I want to just read a couple of sentences which actually shows how this thinking is developed now in a very stark way. This is the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking to a think tank of the Foreign Ministry in Beijing just last month. And I quote, "We must actively explore solutions to the hot issues with Chinese characteristics and play a more constructive role in the stability of the world." Now that really does, that's a very aspirational statement. Now, what he means by Chinese characteristics is precisely this point. How do we intervene and not violate our principles? And I've spoken to Chinese Foreign Ministry officials about this who say, we have to come up with a new term. They love the word harmonious. Maybe harmonious intervention. So I think this is a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. The Chinese
pleasant invasion.
Yeah. It's a very clunky policy. I'm sure Tom knows better than I do, but the policy making in China is about scholars presenting papers, moving upwards through the system, and then the leadership in this sort of black box sort of saying, oh, I like that one. And every now and again you hear that a policy paper has been initialed by a Politburo member. So I think this process is ongoing, and it's not complete. But one thing I will say lastly is that they're very quickly learning how to use this power. And we saw Xi Jinping at Davos last year make a striking speech about wanting to become the builder of a world order, not just the supplicant to it. And I think one thing is that the Chinese get very upset with this notion that they somehow don't adhere to norms and values. The whole Western sort of rhetoric is, no, you've got to stick with us because the Chinese don't believe in norms and values. Well, they would like to contribute to that. It's a question of how, in this new world, they conduct themselves diplomatically.
But each of these could become a trigger for something greater, because it's one thing to speak about China's aspirations or where it wants to go, but what happens when it sort of comes up against an equally immutable force? Humphrey, if I could turn to you here, because you've built several scenarios, some of them very frightening, many of them very believable, including the war between India and China that could be set off through Tibet, but also with China's help to Pakistan. I mean, that's the scenario that you had built. Given what we are hearing, how likely do you see some of the books that you wrote maybe years ago coming through?
Well, the scenarios I wrote 10 years ago or so haven't really changed. So you still have that same, you have India here, Pakistan, depending which way you're looking at it, China, and the US very far away. Pakistan and China geographically are not going anywhere. And the relationship between Pakistan and China is that strong. It's not going to break. You've got the US at the moment as a weakened force in Asia. We see this every day. We saw it just 2 or 3 days ago when Asian countries resurrected the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement without America that most people thought needed the US on there. You've got now, I think about, I don't know, say 10 years ago, around the Iraq War and Arab Spring, the US talked about about democracy and how it was the democratic systems, often quoting India, that would bring a panoply of good things, electricity and roads and water and all that sort of stuff. That shifted mainly because it didn't work, and now what you hear about is that China needs to join the rules-based order of international law. When you see that from Beijing, that's a rigged rules-based order. As Tom said, the century of humiliation continues. It's an American-led post-World War rules-based order, of which China is just sitting in and begging for a seat at the edge of the table occasionally. The world's second biggest economy has 6% voting rights in the International Monetary Fund and that sort of thing. China, I think, started with Xi Jinping's Davos speech a year ago to saying, all right then, if you don't let us into your rules-based order, we will build our own. And at that stage, you have what is called the status quo power, that's the US and the Western democracies, against a rising power. And in that, there could be any sorts of triggers that could start a wider element of things happening, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's Korea, whether it's the Himalayas, Dockland, something like that. So you're beginning to get this new Cold War instance, and I think both countries, China and the US, are faced with a dilemma on this, and that's to do with missile technology and cyber warfare, is that if they fought a war now, the US would win, and if the war was fought for, say, a year, the Chinese economy would take a hit of 20%, and the US economy would take a hit of 5 to 10%. So both would sort of survive it, and the US would win. If they wait and they fight a war, or it comes to a war situation 20 years from now, the US and China would be on equal footing, both with their economies, their world status, and their militaries. So the problem I see is not so much what China is doing, because China is simply doing what big powers do. It's what the Soviet Union did, it's what the US did. And if you look at the South China Sea, the US created its area of control in the Caribbean in the 19th century. Just what China is doing now to protect its trade routes and to protect its territory. So if you look at it from China, that's just what happens. It doesn't matter whether Xi Jinping's in power or Deng Xiaoping's in power or anybody's in power, because it's got the money and the military and the science, it's moving like that. What is going to need to change is the mindset in Washington and the West. And that hasn't changed at the moment, I think, as we've been hearing, is it hasn't accepted that there's a new kid on the block and how that new kid needs to be accommodated to become an equal player without conflict. And that, I think, is the scenario that we're faced with now, and whether it's Taiwan again or North Korea, which is very interesting, South China Sea, or something completely different, or up at Dockland, there will be a trigger, and that trigger will bring the US Congress, US patriotism, head-to-head with the desire of China to make China great again.
And certainly, as the US comes to terms with the, you said new kid on the block, but when that new kid on the block actually becomes number one, I think that's going to set off its own triggers. Tom, here in India, India was, of course, the only country invited that did not go to the Belt and Road Forum. The reasons that the government gave were, of course, one of sovereignty, the Belt and Road Initiative, certainly the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor goes through land that India claims. But the larger question, and then there was the question of debt trapping India's neighbors, and that, you know, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh would face the brunt of China's economic policies and trade policies when it came to the Belt and Road. But the larger question, which I don't think can be surmounted, which is why India is still not a part of the Belt and Road, is the question of agenda. You've actually been on parts of the Belt and Road as it's being constructed through these countries. Give us a sense of what you see as China's agenda when it comes to the initiative.
Right, it's quite complex, and I think that the way it's viewed from India is that it's hegemonic, right? This is a purely geopolitical play, okay? And there certainly is an element of that there, but it's not, I think, the first impulse actually coming from China. So I think actually more important from China's perspective are sort of national security and economic development, okay? So I think economic development, I'll start there. So China's been doing a lot of things over its borders and abroad now for quite a long time. But the idea of a new Silk Road, you know, the Belt and Road, the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, to use their full, very clunky names. They sound better in Chinese, I have to say.
Tell us what they are in Chinese.
Well, God, what is it? Silk Road Economic Belt. It's 四手经济带 or something like that. I haven't heard it, I haven't thought about it for a long time in Chinese. And actually Maritime Road, it's Hailu in Chinese, which kind of makes sense. You can talk about sort of sea lanes in Chinese as roads. But anyway. And it's 一带一路, which means one belt, one road in Chinese. But when Xi Jinping first started speaking about this in the autumn of 2013, at that time, China's economy was beginning to suffer. Right? So China structurally is slowing down. It will continue slowing. In the last 2 years, it's bounced back a bit, but structurally, it is slowing down. And China has, a lot of big engineering firms, a lot of capital goods exporters who were struggling for demand at home. Okay? So one thing they wanted to do was simply to find new markets abroad, not just to find them, but to create them. Okay? So that's one thing. Another thing is that China's own border regions remain underdeveloped. So China wants to bring development to those border regions, and it wants to kind of shift its own development patterns sort of over its borders so that it can trade with those poor countries around it. So, for example, whether that's, that could be Laos. It could be, Kazakhstan is less poor, but it's there. It could be Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, these sorts of places. Okay, so that's a sort of economic rationale. But then there's also a sort of national security rationale as well. So one thing is, this infrastructure, it's about roads and rail, it's about power grids, those sorts of things. It's also about pipelines, oil and gas. So, China is very scared that the US could potentially blockade the Straits of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore. And so it wants to find alternative routes for those resource imports. So, for example, it's got a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan, an oil one from Kazakhstan. It's got twin pipelines that go through Burma, for example. So there's that as well. So, there are good domestic reasons why China is trying to do this. Now, of course, also, it wants to have greater leverage in its backyard, right? So as China rises, it wants to be able to persuade countries on its borders to, in the first place, to adhere to what it calls its core interests. So who will support it on things like Taiwan, on Tibet, on Xinjiang, on the South China Sea. And you already see that leverage in places like Cambodia, where China is building the infrastructure there. So as I say, it's about sort of national security. But this kind of, eventually, this has geopolitical implications. So even when China is purely about trying to create new markets, what it says to underdeveloped countries is, look, you need roads, you need railways, you need a power grid, you need fiber optic cables, whatever. And you don't have the ability to build that, nor do you have the financial capacity to do it. Guess what? We have both. And we want new markets, so that is win-win. That's fine. But of course, once you start building stuff abroad...
As many say, whenever China says win-win, they mean both wins for China.
Well, that's what people say, right? And I think, in some instances, that does happen. It may not actually be China's motive, right? But I think once you gain economic leverage somewhere, then it's only very natural that you gain geopolitical leverage. And to chime in with what Michael was saying, once you have assets abroad, then at some point you might have to protect those assets, right? So what if, for example, there was a civil war in Kazakhstan when Nazarbayev, decides to pop his clogs, right? If somebody threatens China's pipelines, maybe the PLA will have to go over the border. We saw in Libya in 2011, China had to evacuate 35,000 Chinese citizens from that country, right? They were human assets. But, in the future, they may have to protect sort of economic assets, and you see that in the film. Sorry?
Djibouti is one of them.
Yes, absolutely. Right? Djibouti is China's first military base abroad. And I would urge you to kind of understand how China thinks at the moment and to see how China wants to be, to watch a film that came out 6 months ago. It's called Wolf Warrior 2. And this is a film which tries to kind of slay all of the things that really annoy Chinese people about how they're viewed abroad or how they view themselves. So it's to put it very, very simply, it's about a Chinese factory and Chinese hospital in Africa that's threatened when there's a coup in the African country, and an ex-special ops soldier from the PLA goes in and tries to save these people. He also saves the Africans. And at the same time, you have the Chinese Navy who are sort of sailing across the Indian Ocean and are going to evacuate not just Chinese people, but a few Africans too. But during the film, this guy is very strong. Chinese people think that Westerners particularly see them as weak. They don't think that they can hold their alcohol, that they don't get pretty girls, all those sorts of things. And in this film, he's better at football than the Africans. He can drink the Africans under the table. He gets the pretty American Western girl. And he saves the Chinese, he saves the Africans, and the Chinese embassy is seen as a safe haven, whereas the Americans are utterly useless. And so this is a sort of image of what China wants to be, if you like, and I think it's well worth watching.
And we still have to see the film. Michael, just to pick up from what Tom said over there, so what is it that China is doing in these countries that you have studied so closely, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's Indonesia, Philippines, and Cambodia, as he said. And how does the reaction, Tom spoke about the idea that China's reaction to how it is perceived may actually make it do things which are much tougher. So what I mean is, how will China see India's moves, perhaps with the Indo-Pacific idea or the Quad, in terms of its influence in Southeast Asia?
I want to make 3 points. I mean, the first point in many ways is one that we haven't touched on, which is the unintended consequences of China's impact on the region I live and work in, which is Southeast Asia. Because quite apart from the policy aspects, the money and investment and building of infrastructure, one of the things I point out in my book, Blood and Silk, is that one of the things that keeps governments in my region, Southeast Asia, awake at night is the possibility that if there's an economic downturn in China, I mean, if things don't go so well, hordes of Chinese are simply going to pick up and leave, as they did in the 19th century. The peopling of major urban centers in Southeast Asia in the late 19th century until about the 1920s was essentially done with hordes of Chinese who were leaving the southern coastal areas of China because, for economic reasons, the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the aftermath. And so I think there's a great fear in Southeast Asia, not so much of Chinese aircraft carriers steaming over the horizon, but if things go badly, that Chinese citizens will simply get on budget airline flights and fly into these big cities and hook up with distant relatives. We're already seeing, along with the Chinese investment in infrastructure, is an insistence of bringing Chinese workers. Cambodia has 300,000 to 500,000 Chinese workers working on infrastructure projects. Many of these people will stay. And so there's the sort of social aspect. I mean, tourism in Southeast Asia. Thailand had 12 million Chinese tourists in 2016. They're expecting 15 million, I think, last year. Over the Chinese New Year period, there will be 400,000 Chinese tourists in Bangkok alone. So there is this social presence that Southeast Asia has a long history of dealing with. Secondly, I think it's important to point out that China also has a learning capacity with regard to the way it conducts diplomacy in this region. They realize that things where they used to go and maybe thump the table and say, here's the cash, and by the way, agree to that project. If it doesn't work, they have to go back and think of another way of doing it. We've seen a very good example of this recently in Myanmar and Bangladesh. We know the history, the tragic history of the recent months of 680,000 Rohingya picking up and leaving Myanmar for Bangladesh. And China's initial response to this humanitarian tragedy was, well, as we normally do, we side with the government of Myanmar, with whom we have a friendly relationship, and we're close.
In fact, that was India's response.
And that was India's response too. So one year the foreign minister went to the UN, and many of his colleagues there said, look, this is a humanitarian tragedy, what are you going to do? He said, well, we better think about this. And what we saw last month in December is they turned on a dime. The Chinese foreign minister went to Dhaka, went to Naypyidaw, and brokered a deal between Myanmar and Bangladesh, which everyone was saying as early as sort of October, November, couldn't be done. They have a dreadful bilateral relationship. So we saw China actually come in and broker a deal. Now, that deal not everyone thinks it's all that helpful to the Rohingya people, but from the point of view of Myanmar and Bangladesh, it actually helps them. So my second point is that actually I think they have a learning capacity with diplomacy, and we're going to see them play a much more nuanced, effective role directly in some of these countries where they're involved. I think the third point I would make on the South China Sea. I've been involved somewhat in mediating between some of the claimant states on the specific issue of avoiding incidents at sea. I think it's fair to say that China will never, ever want to involve anyone in helping to resolve the sovereignty disputes. the code of conduct that the Southeast Asian countries are negotiating with China is not going to be a dispute settlement resolution mechanism. But what they are interested in is avoiding war. China doesn't want to go to war in the South China Sea. It doesn't want a confrontation with the US. Neither the Chinese nor the Americans can afford to go to war because their economies are interlinked. And so China, I have found, is in a clunky kind of way looking for a constructive way to manage the situation so there is no conflict, the sovereignty disputes are parked, and that, yes, I think there will be a code of conduct that won't be binding, but will nonetheless create confidence-building mechanisms and ways in which China and these countries can sort of cooperate in this new situation. So I think for those three reasons, we're looking at a more sophisticated approach to involvement and intervention in the region, but it will still face opposition. And going back to Humphrey's point, I mean, from the US, this will be seen as you're taking up our space. And China will continue to see US efforts to deny them that space as containment. And so I think that's the larger geopolitical issue.
All right, so you do see these as containment, or China would see these as containment policies. Humphrey, about a week ago, the Indian Army chief made a statement where he said, I think it is time that we take some of our focus off our borders with Pakistan and refocus them on our boundaries with China. Many have said, I mean, not in India, but perhaps watchers of the situation, many have said India over-exercises itself about the Chinese threat, while China doesn't notice India quite as much. Would you agree?
Yes, completely, because if you're sitting in the foreign ministry in Beijing and the world is spread in front of you like a banquet at a table, and you have a canal that you're building in Nicaragua, and you have a power station you're building in Britain, and you have the India that's it's all part and parcel of the whole Chinese vision, as it were, that's happening. And I think when you sort of talk about separating the borders there, the Pakistan border is the Chinese border. The Chinese border, militarily, it's because these are two staunch allies that are going to come in. But I think something to remember against the other colonial powers of which India has experienced, of Britain and America and Spain and the rest of them, is that China has achieved right up till now what it's achieved without a shot being fired in anger. And it's gone into Cambodia, and it's gone into Nicaragua, and it's built the military base in Djibouti, and so on and so on, all through this ancient, they had one of the ancient strategists, and it's not Sun Tzu, it's another one, and it was this idea of reward and punishment. So they will come in, as they did in the Philippines, 18 months ago or so, with Duterte, said, okay, we don't want to fight you over Scarborough Shoal, one of the South China Sea things. We will build you a high-speed railway down in Mindanao instead and get rid of your Muslim insurgency problem and make it a modern place. And what do you do at that stage? And I talked to the fishermen that were fishing at Scarborough Shoal and had been water cannoned and threatened by the Chinese and weren't allowed to fish there and were expelled for a year. And then after Duterte had gone to Beijing, he came back and said, you can fish again. These fishermen hadn't been able to make a living, and the wives from this village had to take domestic worker contracts in Saudi Arabia in order to survive. So the men had lost their esteem, and the wives were away, and the children were being brought up by foster parents and grandchildren, and suddenly they were told, you can go and fish again, you can be a man again, you can feel what you were and what your grandparents were and ancestors were. Off they went to fish in Scarborough Shoal. And then the next thing is a Chinese official arrives in their little village, a big man from Beijing, and he says, come to China. Let us show you how our fishing trade works. And by the way, you don't have to send your fish to market anymore. We will buy them for above the market price, guaranteed. They don't like that, but they can see that it'll keep the food in the bellies and the kids going to school and all the rest of it. And it's what China is using around Asia and around the world to a certain extent, and what it's seen as the vassal state concept. And taking that story here to India, at some stage, the Indian government will have to decide and have to have the sort of decisions that those fishermen in northern Luzon had to make. How much do we allow them to take from what we have, and how much do we fight them? And if you fight China under this sort of diplomatic military trade doctrine they have, you are punished. If you're with them, you get a reward. But you are not in control of your destiny because China is. And I think we've reached a stage now, and maybe it would have been different if somebody had stopped the South China Sea building, or somebody had done this and that, or if the '62 war had been different, or whatever. But we've reached a stage now where that's pretty much unstoppable without conflict. So it's whether there's going to be a war to change things, or whether India at some stage 10 years from now is going to be not a vassal state, but under the control of China.
Can I address the challenge for India? Because, I mean, if I look at it through the lens of Myanmar, Myanmar always feels that it's a country, unlike the other Southeast Asian countries, that's the most surrounded by bigger powers. India in the West and China in the East. And it says to all the other Southeast Asian countries, you don't have the same problems we do because we have China and India. So China recently launched this initiative, the Myanmar-China corridor, which of course passes right by the Indian border. And there was a very interesting article published out of Delhi, which I thought was interesting, to say, look, how can India actually match this? Because on the Chinese side, on their border with Myanmar, Yunnan, they have a thriving border trade. Most of the goods in central Myanmar come from China. And, you know, if you go to Mandalay, the markets are dominated by Chinese goods. Even the northeast, if you go to Manipur, to Imphal, they all come from China.
I was in Yangon during the Chinese New Year, and it was as if it was a national festival for them.
Now look at the challenge that India has with its Look East, Act East policy. If India opens up that whole northeastern region, I think the biggest fear will be security. China doesn't have that problem on its border. It has, you know, if you look at the population of minorities in Myanmar, it has mirror populations in China who are not fighting insurgencies against the Chinese government. But the Northeast has a whole rainbow collection of insurgencies fighting against the center. And so India's challenge is actually how to open up and look east when it has a security problem along its border. China has the confidence from Yunnan, and often not very much control over what Yunnan does, to sort of say, yes, we can drive our pipelines through, we can have, you know, they don't have the same security challenges.
Can I say something?
I do want to get to the question of how India deals with it, because obviously this is a challenge that India has spoken about. And I had asked a diplomat once, what is your solution? And the diplomat said to me, it is to be the un-China. You know, as in to say, you cannot beat China when it comes to the kind of money they're willing to put in there, or the kind of accommodation they are willing to get out of another country. And yet India has watched as the Maldives has signed an FTA with China saying, we'll buy all your fish. Sri Lanka has given away a port to Chinese companies. Bangladesh is seeing more and more Chinese infrastructure rebuilding its railways. Nepal has now an 8-point agreement with China, which includes access to their dry docks. It includes a rail line coming in from Lhasa into Nepal as well. And India has, you know, clearly no leverage when it comes to Pakistan and the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So the question really is, how does India address this challenge? Is being the un-China an option?
Okay, before I come to that, I just want to sort of respond a little bit to what Michael was saying. The first thing is, I mean, the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar economic corridor, which is what he's talking about, it's been sort of planned for 20 years or so, and India is actually an official part of it, and, you know, it does officially take part. And you were talking about the security issues there. I mean, that's actually one of the reasons why China is spending so much money in Pakistan and in its own border region of Xinjiang, where it's terrified of what Uyghur insurgents can do. And, you know, I spoke to somebody a couple of years ago who is very connected in Beijing, but spends a lot of time in Pakistan as well. And he said, to be perfectly honest with you, the reason that China is talking about, it's not actually investing sort of 50 billion plus US dollars, but more like lending it to the Pakistanis, is that it's a giant bribe, saying, you know, we will do all this for you if you sort out your terrorism and you sort out sort of Muslim extremists coming over the border, all those things that China worries about. Anyway, to come to your other point about what should India do? Well, I think we're actually seeing a sort of incipient policy already. And I think it's really the Indo-Japanese alliance, which I think we can talk about now. Obviously, India doesn't have allies officially, but it is working much more closely with the Japanese now. And the Japanese are very much trying to push back against China's rise. In fact, Japan was there first. Japan has been doing this stuff since the 1960s. Japan came up with the Asian Development Bank precisely so that it could build infrastructure abroad and create markets. China now is doing the same with its policy banks and to a lesser extent with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But of course, you have Japan building the bullet train from Ahmedabad to Mumbai. You have India and Japan sort of talking about investing across Africa as well, also working together in ASEAN, all these sorts of things. So I think in a sense, that is a sort of alternative model. But one thing I would say there is that I agree that China uses sticks and carrots, and that if you're a small country, if you're sort of economically underdeveloped, China has enormous power, right? If you're Cambodia, for example, you can't say no to Chinese roads. It's very, very difficult. If you're Laos, you can't say no to Chinese dams, whatever it might be. But actually, bigger countries have much more power. So South Korea and Japan, yes, they're worried about China for other reasons, but they're not worried about China taking over economically. And I think it's the same for India. India is too big, it's too strong. So, it does have an ability to push back a little bit. My final point, though, is that I do think it's sad that India and China do not work more closely together. Now, I understand why. I think a lot of it goes back to 1962. Frankly, India just doesn't trust China, and it was humiliated. And it's very, very difficult, I think, to kind of get past that. But it's ridiculous that, if you want to fly from Delhi to Beijing, there's one flight a day and it leaves at 3:30 in the morning, right? There are almost no flights between Delhi and Beijing, the capitals of the two most populous countries in the world, whereas if you want to fly from Beijing to Bangkok, the last time I counted, it was something like 30 flights a day or something. And, there's a huge amount of trade between India and China, but there isn't much Chinese in investment in India. I know it's growing a little bit. You have some stuff in Tamil Nadu with mobile phones and that sort of thing, but there could be so much more. And I think when Modi came into power, there was this great hope that, he visited China 6 times or whatever it was, and that, they would do business together. And for whatever reasons, and, mainly the fault of the Chinese, when it comes to, sort of incursions on the border, it really hasn't happened. But it's such a missed opportunity, I think, for Asia.
I guess the question for us is also, and we haven't mentioned it, the new national security strategy that Secretary of Defense Mattis just announced last week, which actually really firmly establishes something that the United States has been moving towards in the last 5 or 10 years, as the sort of war on terror has, the global war on terror has sort of run out of steam. They've started to focus on China's emerging military capacity and the need to actually accept the fact that in another 20 years or so, they may not be able to fight such an easy war against the Chinese.
So what we are seeing is a growing realization that the US-China rivalry is going to shape this century, even if the Asian century is not yet come. I'd like to stop right now and take questions. I can sort of see a few hands up. If you could take your mics to, maybe let's take like a few questions in the front here and then we'll move on.
My name's Wendy. I'm from Australia. I'd like to ask the panel, you may be aware that what China is doing in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, it's also doing in Australia. So we have a situation where China owns a major port in Australia that is a base for the US military. China's also buying up lots of property in Australia, and this is having
I'm going to ask you to get to a question.
a major impact on the next election coming from Australia. So again, perhaps from Michael, what do you see could be the issues there? Australia's now being jammed between US and China.
All right.
How should we respond? Thank you.
Let's take a few questions. Yeah. Go ahead. There's the gentleman there. Yeah. Hold on one sec, sir. He's just...
I was always surprised how China was allowed to do what it did to Tibet. And what the world thinks that it will not do the same to Nepal or Bhutan or Sri Lanka or Maldives and Pakistan.
All right. You're speaking specifically of the 1950s, 59. Okay. All right. Okay. Yes, sir.
This is, we have kind of assumed that China will follow a straight line trajectory, all its lifetime. I don't know whether that is fair, and there are no internal, conflicts, or there are no internal considerations that will hold back and they'll create problems for them. Because if it is so simple, China is right, going
Sure.
to...
And China has changed course, whether it's been the Philippines.
And there's a lot of talk about internal dissent. I don't know how much of it you all will know, and how much of it is real and how much of it is...
All right. And how much of a situation that would have. And there are two gentlemen in that row, and then we'll stop. Oh, right there.
My question is from the panel. Two of the biggest economies of the world, the US and the ever-rising Chinese economy. China wants to get on stage with the US with an economy of 18 trillion or more and have the same military might within a couple of decades, whereas it took the US over 2 centuries. And then the Chinese economy is not a very tested economy. I mean, American economy is tested, well tested, has gone through many depressions.
What's the question, sir?
Yeah, I'm getting there. Has gone through many depressions. That's not necessarily the fact with the Chinese economy. The other aspect is the life in China. People, cocooned, kept away from the social media, the government feeding them what they so feel appropriate, and the extravagant Chinese defense budget.
I really have to ask you to give me a question.
Okay, I'll get there.
Don't get there. Tell me what the question is.
That's the question. I mean, that's a lot of happening.
What is the question? That China is
that's a lot of...
not yet a tested power. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's... I am asking the question, ma'am.
Let's move on.
The driving force, what's the driving force behind all this happening that has been going on?
Fine, we get it. And one last one before I go to the panel.
Madam, recently we have taken note of all these world developments in view of China expansionist economy and our defense, and especially in the recently Davos meeting and Asian conference going on in Delhi. So we have very late started our this.
Has India started
now in future there can be new alignments with Vietnam and other countries which are not satisfied and have border disputes with China.
All right.
And also with America.
Fine.
So
You're
new
suggesting
new defense strategy can be charted out.
An alternative strategy. Most of the questions are actually comments here, but I think there are a couple of interesting ones. The lady wanted to know about the kind of impact China may have on an election inside Australia.
I do want to make this point. I think when China invests and buys businesses and so on, it's pretty much the way the corporate world works, and that can work or not work. But one of the things that China can do in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, particularly where there are large Chinese communities, is there is a sort of form of extraterritoriality that comes into play. We've seen this in the last 20 years, where China, for maybe political reasons, but also for understandable reasons, gets concerned about its Chinese communities overseas. Chinese nationality law, and maybe Tom has knowledge of this, is a little bit obscure on this sometimes. Someone who is born in another country but who is Chinese, and if China decides that if that's a persecuted minority, they should take an interest in that. So there is that.
Well, India does that too.
Exactly.
India's government stands up for the diaspora all the time.
The trouble is that gets conflated when Chinese people come into politics, and to what extent the suspicion that they may fall under influence. However, on the business side, I mean, business is business. And if you own a chunk of real estate, then you do want to have voting rights. And so it's kind of understandable that they want to, just the way that other countries with large corporate interests try to influence politics. That is more or less understandable. What I'm interested in is the creeping extraterritoriality.
Okay, I do want to put the question with a little bit of a rider. You know, Humphrey spoke earlier about the idea that China feels that most of this is a Western construct. When the West says China is breaking the international rules-based order. China wants to know what was the rules-based order when the US invaded Afghanistan, or the second war in Iraq, or even Libya for that matter, when a right to protect mandate was turned into a right to get rid of Gaddafi mandate. So there is this question that keeps coming up. Is China right when it says that there is a sort of Western construct conspiracy against it? And does it have a bad rap? We heard the young gentleman there saying basically, you know, Chinese people have no rights inside China, and China is an untested economic power, and the US has taken its time to get to that position is the problem really that China is misunderstood?
That's a very, very difficult question. I think it is misunderstood. I would say in the first place that, you know, it's true that, you know, the modern world was divided up at Bretton Woods in a certain way, and this is something that India is also annoyed about. And you know, China has been very deliberately over the last few years not trying to so much sort of knock down the existing order, but to supplement it and try to augment it and change it. And you can see that now, and I think in a sense that's actually quite positive, and it might be positive for India if China was to let India in, which it won't. But is China misunderstood? There was a question about, you know, will China go the way, you know, it invaded Tibet. It also, if you go back, it also, you know, it invaded Xinjiang as well. You know, it was an empire, it did expand. You know, China always claims that it was never a sort of expansionary state. That's nonsense. But actually, it hasn't done anything since the 50s in Tibet. And to reassure you, I do not believe, at least, and of course I could be wrong and things change, but I do not believe that outside the South China Sea, where China, yes, it is putting military installations there, I do not believe that it has any intention at all of sort of military conquest over its borders. And to get to the point that, that was made about China's sort of internal problems, you know, China has enough to deal with at home without trying to kind of conquer other countries abroad. Trying to deal with Xinjiang, which is a much bigger problem than Tibet, is difficult enough. So I don't think it will do that. Is China misunderstood? I think it is partly because it's very difficult to speak to China, and you know, that's its own fault. You know, it's the nature, unfortunately, of the Communist Party, and the fact that, you know, they are control freaks. That's what communists do. And, you know, they do not believe in free flows of information, and they don't let people, you know, speak. There's no Chinese person here for a very good reason, right? They couldn't speak about this sort of thing. So, of course, it's misunderstood because you can't speak to them. So I think that you know, that is kind of fair.
All right, Humphrey, last word to you.
No, I think, I just wanted to, the Australian question, it's quite interesting that the Australians do not carry out freedom of navigation operations within the 12-mile area on the South China Sea, whereas the Americans do, and they don't do it because they don't want the economic consequences attached to it. And therefore, if you break down the Australia-US thing, which China obviously wants to do, you weaken that alliance. On the issues, I mean, I think that I would prefer to be born in a very poor village in China than in a very poor village in India, of course. And I think you've got a better chance in China. I think they've got a rules-based education policy, whereas I've been, as many of you, I'm sure, been to the villages in India, where you've still got those same problems of poverty, health, caste, and all the rest of it that hasn't yet been resolved. And in a way, I think that it's not a matter of what's right and what's wrong, which I think you said, is it right? I think it's what is and what isn't. And I can take that analogy from the village in China to a village in the Congo or something like that, is that China has proved that its system has dragged people out of poverty and given them electric lights and given them education and taken it to where it is now, and now we all have to deal with it. We all who used to say China's going to fall apart and the communist system won't arrive and Chinese can't talk to each other and all the rest of it, I don't believe that. I believe there's more debate in China than there is, as much debate in China as there is anywhere else in the world. It's done at a different level. And it's done at a different level because the country is not as free as the Western democracies, because it's not as economically and politically advanced as the Western democracies, and it will get to that stage. But we have to see how we're going to fit into that along the line.
Can I add one thing to that? Is that possible? So I agreed with a lot of that, especially about it's better to be born poor in China than it is here in India. But when it comes to debate, I'm afraid this is simply not true. I mean, of course there is debate in China.
You're talking about public debate or private debate?
Both. I mean, there is private debate too, of course, but if you can't speak publicly, then that does mean that there's sort of less debate generally.
Okay. But we are living in a world where dissent is not exactly, treated at a premium in many parts of the world, but I do take your point, we're sort of exactly out of time. Humphrey making an important point there at the end that maybe India needs the Tang Hui, is that it? The hiding light?
Ta Guang Yang Hui.
Okay.
I'm not sure it needs that.
India needs a little bit of hiding light, building its own strengths, and perhaps a new strategy, as the gentleman here suggested. But this is a debate that I'm sure we will be coming back to, perhaps even next year here at Jaipur, because this is a space that we're going to continue to watch. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'm sorry I couldn't take more questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a varied panel and varied views, and I agree it's a very debatable subject.